fraud is never a good thing, particularly when it goes undetected. However, once fraud is detected, can fraud allow organizations to improve controls, lower costs, and make organizational changes? In other words, can some good come out of fraud? In today's podcast, we will discuss good fraud versus bad fraud and how organizations can turn bad to good and derive value from a seemingly negative scenario. Our speaker today is Jonny Frank, partner at Stoneturn in New York. Jonny brings over 40 years of public and private sector and law and business school teaching experience in forensic investigations, compliance, and risk management. Jonny helps organizations and counsel remediate misconduct and address regulatory findings. He is well known for his work in risk assessment, remediation, controls testing, and compliance monitoring. He joined Stoneturn from PwC, where he was a partner, and founded and globally led the fraud risk and controls practice. Jonny also served as the Executive Assistant United States Attorney, Eastern District of New York, a Senior Faculty Fellow at the Yale School of Management, and an Adjunct Associate Professor at Fordham University Law School and Brooklyn Law School. A warm welcome, Jonny, to the Fraudopedia podcast. For many of us, it would seem that there's no such thing as good fraud. However, you have a nuanced view about this, and I'm keen on discussing your views about good fraud versus bad fraud. So, what are some examples of a good fraud? What is a good fraud?
A good fraud is something that if you can find it and detect it and stop it, it will increase either revenue, decrease costs, and increase the value of the company. In fact, the way I came upon this concept was years ago, I was working in the merger and acquisition area, and it occurred to me that as one does diligence, good frauds are the frauds that you won't tell if you're the buyer, you won't tell the seller about, because after the transaction, you'll be able to make more money. So a perfect example of that is a kickback, right? So if a company has an employee who's receiving kickbacks, if you can find that out, you'll then be able to reduce your costs, because typically a kickback would occur when either you're giving an excessive discount or you're paying too much for a product, and there's a kickback, so you can then achieve that difference. So kickbacks are a classic good fraud, if you will.
So in contrast, then, what are examples of bad fraud? I assume would be a bad fraud?
Yeah, cooking the books is a classic bad fraud because you're overstating the value of the company and you're going to get in trouble. Another bad fraud, which I like to place next to good fraud, is corruption. Because corruption is you will then get in legal trouble, right? But if you think about it, to make a corrupt payment, you have to get money out of the company. So if you get the money out of the company and put it in your pocket, that's a good fraud, because if you could stop that, the money will go into the company's pocket, not the employee who's stealing it. If the money goes into a foreign official's pocket, then it's a bad fraud because you get into trouble. But that's kind of a juxtaposition of the two, if you will. But again, just thinking about it, if I could stop it, will I make more money?
Okay. So how do organizations then identify good fraud? What are some strategies they can adopt to identify good fraud which is happening in their company?
Yes, I think the most important thing is to try to unlock it from the businesses, meaning it's not something that one could just leave to compliance or internal audit or legal, but you really need to go to the company, and business leaders need to look at their process. And just basically drawing a process map is one way of doing it. And as you're going through that process map, to be thinking about, okay, what could go wrong and how might there be a good fraud? But then the second form of the brainstorming, so that's the first part of the brainstorming, what go wrong, okay? And there are different strategies of doing that, which we could talk about a little bit later. Red teaming is one, for example, where you have people going against each other. But then after you identify what the opportunities are, you would then brainstorm using forensic people, hopefully. If this fraud were to manifest in my company, what would be the red flags that I would have missed along the way, but that will come up in the investigation? So, for example, if I'm investigating a kickback, I think there's a possibility that I could get a kickback to my sales distribution, right? If the company ordinarily gives a 10% discount for a volume discount, and then you see a customer getting a 20% discount, that would be a red flag. Now, you might not normally think about that, but if you're investigating that sort of scheme, again, you're going to find out those sorts of red flags along the way. Because when, Vidya, as you well know, when you do an investigation, invariably, you're going to find things that, hey, if these people had spotted this indicator along the way, they could have prevented or detected the issue much earlier. So that's the best strategy for identifying good fraud. Of course, in today's world, one also must think of AI, and AI is getting better and better. I mean, in terms of fraud and AI, the leaders in this were the credit card companies, and this goes back close to 30 years already, where perhaps we didn't call it artificial intelligence, but there was so much of the same type of fraud that would occur that the companies were able to mathematically program and to look at the data for indicators of good fraud. So when one looks at possibilities of finding red flags and finding good fraud, it's essential that you work with people in your company, if not an outsider, who specializes in this on using artificial intelligence to try to spot indicators.
So I think, you mentioned red flags as critical, but in an organization, whose role is it to identify red flags? Will it be internal audit, risk and compliance, legal, HR? You said forensics team. Is there any particular group which is more suited to identifying these red flags?
So there is the development of the red flags, and then there's the identification of the red flags, right? And I'd like to split that in between. From my perspective, the risk owners are the ones who also own the red flags. And in a typical company, some companies embrace it, some don't, but it's the business that owns the risk, and it's the businesses that one would be able to unlock the red flags for that particular area. So, for example, marketing would be a area of potential good fraud, right? You would want to focus with the marketing people again of how, what sort of schemes might occur, and how would you go, and what would be the red flags for that. So that's the development of the red flags. For the identification of the red flags, this is where it's really twofold. There's a data aspect to it. And again, going back to AI, the difference between the AI world and the pre-AI world for a non-technical person like myself is in the pre-AI world, you were only able to really use structured data, if you will. In the post-AI world, you could use unstructured data, and AI will basically structure it. In any event, having said that, you would then, first of all, try to find it with the data. So in terms of who has responsibility is, can you put it in a machine so that the machine has the responsibility? But then I would say in terms of responsibility for detecting red flag, I think it occurs for everybody in the organization. So starting with the business leaders of, how would they be able to detect the red flags? Because when you have fraud, whether it be bad or good, it's the business unit leader who's going to own it, and people are going to say, well, how come you didn't find it? And if there are red flags that are published, they should be looking for those red flags as they monitor and review the business. The same is true, though, internal audit, right? So if internal audit comes in, and internal audit as part of its planning, it should be thinking about good fraud. And then if fraud occurs after, or is discovered after internal audit has been, it's a natural question someone's going to ask, well, how come internal audit didn't find it? Compliance, a little bit less so, although I think ironically, I think they're missing the boat. Compliance folks tend to, unfortunately, think of themselves solely in terms of protecting the company from legal liability, as opposed to thinking of themselves as a potential profit center, not just a cost center, right? And thinking about if compliance did change their attitude by looking for good fraud, the compliance group could change its reputation from being a cost center to being more of a profit center. So, in terms of whose role it is, I suppose it's everybody's role to execute the strategy once you've identified the good fraud opportunities and your strategy for identifying and detecting them.
Okay. So can organizations then use these good fraud techniques to improve fraud awareness training? Seems to me that
Yes.
that's an opportunity.
Absolutely. And I think it's important. What I like to say is important to remember that for-profit companies exist for profit. Okay, that's their fundamental reason for being. People don't like to think about bad fraud because those are the things that take away from making money, or at least people think about that. That's why compliance, for example, in many companies, people think of it as a revenue prevention officer, which is a shame, but that's how people think of clients, right? The nice thing about good fraud is you're focusing on how can I help them make more money for the company, right? So by focusing on good fraud, and then it can spill over, if you will, to compliance and bad fraud, right? But how do I identify risks that will allow me to maximize revenue and prevent revenue leakage? How could I as an employee, help the company cut costs by identifying fraud, waste, and abuse? How could I, as an employee or a business leader, help the company save assets from misappropriation, right? So both fraud awareness as well as a risk-based culture. Good fraud is a wonderful way to embed that in the organization. Again, because it is focused on how can I help the company make more money? And that will resonate with the business leaders.
Excellent. I think that's, well taken point, that how can employees help companies to identify leakages and plug those leakages? And what else can organizations do to identify good fraud?
So the challenge with good fraud is most people don't think like fraudsters and they get uncomfortable. So I'll give you an example. You and I were at PricewaterhouseCoopers, and you and I would work with financial statement auditors whose job it was to find fraud. And I would say, by the way, don't rely upon your auditor to try to find good fraud. They're just not gonna be able to do it. But I remember very well the auditors would say something like, well, you don't know of any fraud here, do you? Because they were uncomfortable with the topic. So techniques that I would recommend is get people comfortable about speaking about the topic. So let me give you an example. We will, with companies, host a perfect crime dinner or a perfect crime lunch. So who's ever listening to this podcast, rather than talking about a sports match or anything like that at the next lunch, if you're a business leader, ask everybody to attend the lunch and then say, come to the lunch with, if I had to steal money from the company, or if I was a vendor to the company, or if I was a customer of the company, how would I steal money from the company? That they have to come to the lunch, dinner, whatever, right, with the perfect crime, and have people sit in tables of 4 or 5, have them talk about it. The next step, either at that lunch, but I think it's probably going to be a second lunch, is you have the same people get together and you select 1 or 2 of the perfect crimes and then divide the table into 2 groups. I call them the angels and the demons. And the demons would explain how they would be able to get rid of that crime or commit that crime at the company. And the angels would try to defend why the company would not be vulnerable to that crime. As a hint, by the way, or a spoiler alert, whatever team has IT on it, technology oftentimes will win the game. A variation of the same angels against demons team is to read the newspaper and listen to the news and listen to, the next fraud scheme either in your industry to try to understand, the nuts and bolts. And it could be a competitor. So if you're at a bank, such and such bank had a fraud. Again, the same sort of exercise. How can that occur here? Again, red teaming sort of exercises where one team would then say, well, this is how we could commit it here. And the other team would say, this is how we commit it there. And what our experience has been with clients is whether, they do that themselves or engage it with us or whatever, that lubricates the out of the box thinking, if you will, for people to then really brainstorm. And at the most mature companies, whether it be a good fraud or bad fraud, right? It just becomes part of the culture where whenever there's a business decision, whenever you're thinking of doing a new product, it's just part of the conversation of what could go wrong and then focusing on the good fraud aspect of it, right? Is there any way that we could, who might cheat us here outside the firm or inside the firm? So it's really misconduct against the organization, either by insider threat or external threats. And then you develop that culture so that it's always there. And then you full circle, right? Then to start thinking about the red flags and how you might be able to find it.
Oh, that's very interesting because I think you could also perhaps on an anonymous basis use social media or even the intranet within your company and you socialize, a good fraud and say, well, how would the demons react?
That's right.
That's one way also of broadening this discussion. Any concluding comments or thoughts on good fraud versus bad fraud?
Yes, I mean, my concluding comments is kind of like a repetition, but to a certain extent is for-profit companies exist for profit. To be thinking about fraud and compliance not as I'm doing this to avoid a violation of law, but rather I'm doing this for the good of the company. Let me give you one more anecdote, by the way, in the money laundering area to maybe this would drive home this point. Okay. I was working with the bank which had a $250 billion money laundering problem. Okay. And the bank realized that telling employees that we have to know your customer, that just wasn't working. And telling employees that if you don't do this, the bank is going to get into legal trouble really wasn't motivating people. In that good fraud sort of concept that it's good for you, right, as opposed to the company, they changed their message to saying, who wants to work for a bank where we're helping bad guys commit crimes? Who wants to work for a bank that helps terrorists commit terror? And again, it's that part of good fraud is kind of like not just good for the company, but making it feel better for myself. So it's
Right.
really trying to take the positive. My concluding remark is try to think of these things as positively and try to embrace it as a way of helping the company make more money and feeling better about your job.
Oh, that's very interesting. And thank you so much for sharing your insights and time with us. And I do hope organizations will embrace this concept of good fraud so that they can prevent bad frauds in the future. We conclude this podcast now and thank Jonny for sharing his insights and time with us. We hope that you find this podcast meaningful and interesting. See you next month.